They chose death over surrender, and we faced that choice every day. The first thing you noticed about Saipan wasn't the sound of the artillery or the screaming of the corsairs overhead. It wasn't even the crack of rifle fire echoing off those limestone cliffs that rose like God's own fortress walls from the Pacific. No, the first thing that hit you was the smell. Salt and cordite, and something else. Something sweet and sick that made your stomach turn even before you understood what it was. I was Corporal Jake Morrison then, 2nd Battalion, 27th Infantry Division, and I'd already seen my share of blood in the Gilberts and the Marshalls. But nothing, and I mean nothing, had prepared me for what we found on those beaches of Saipan on June 15, 1944. The landing craft bucked and rolled in the choppy waters, and through the spray and the diesel fumes, I could see the island rising before us like a green and brown nightmare. Palm trees swayed in the morning breeze, looking almost peaceful if you could ignore the pillboxes tucked between their trunks and the muzzle flashes winking from the caves carved into the coral. Remember what the lieutenant said, Sergeant Pete Kowalski shouted over the engine noise, his Chicago accent thick with tension. The Japs got 27,000 troops on this rock, maybe more. They ain't gonna roll over and play dead like some of the other islands. 27,000. The number bounced around in my head as our Higgins boat ground against the coral shelf, and the ramp dropped with a metallic clang. I'd later learn we were wrong about that number, dead wrong. The Japanese had closer to 31,000 defenders waiting for us, dug in deeper than ticks and just as hard to root out. The water was chest deep and warm as blood, and the weight of my pack and rifle tried to drag me down to the coral bottom. Machine gun fire from the ridgeline above sent geysers of water dancing around us, and I heard Corporal Danny Reeves let out a curse that would have made his Irish grandmother weep. To my left, Private First Class Miguel Santos from El Paso was praying in rapid Spanish, clutching his rifle like a crucifix. We struggled through the surf toward Red Beach 2, and that's when I saw them, the first bodies. Japanese soldiers who'd been caught in the preliminary bombardment lay twisted in the sand, their khaki uniforms dark with blood and seawater. But what stopped me cold wasn't the enemy dead. It was one of our own boys from the first wave, a kid who couldn't have been more than 19, lying face down in the white sand with his helmet blown clean off his head. "Don't stop." "Morrison," Kowalski yelled, grabbing my shoulder and pushing me toward the tree line. "You stop, you die." The sand beneath our boots was already stained pink, and more bodies, ours and theirs, littered the beach like driftwood after a storm. The Japanese had turned this stretch of paradise into a killing field, with interlocking fields of fire from concealed positions that our naval bombardment had barely scratched. Every palm tree could hide a sniper. Every coral outcropping might conceal a machine gun nest, and every shadow might be the last thing you ever saw. I dove behind a wrecked Amtrak, its armor plating peeled back like a tin can, and tried to get my bearings. The noise was incredible, rifles cracking, mortars thumping, the whine and crash of artillery, and underneath it all, a sound I'd never heard before. It was high-pitched and wild, almost like singing, coming from the cliffs above us. Later, I'd learn it was Japanese soldiers chanting death songs, preparing themselves for what they called the honorable death, rather than the shame of surrender. They chose death over surrender, I muttered to myself, not knowing how prophetic those words would prove to be. Santos crawled up beside me, his face streaked with sand and sweat. "Corporal, what's the plan?" "We can't stay here all day." "The plan?" What was the plan when you were pinned down on a beach with nowhere to go but up? And up meant charging straight into the mouths of caves filled with Japanese defenders who'd rather die than give an inch. The plan was to move forward, always forward, because the only way off this beach was through those cliffs, and the only way through those cliffs was over the bodies of men who'd made dying their highest virtue. "We go up," I told Santos, checking me rifle and trying to ignore the way my hands were shaking. "We go up, and we keep going up until there's nobody left to shoot at us." The first banzai charge came at sunset on our second day ashore. We'd managed to push maybe half a mile inland, setting up a perimeter around what had once been a sugar mill, but was now just twisted metal and concrete rubble. The Japanese had been probing our lines all day, small groups of 2 or 3 soldiers trying to find weak spots, testing our resolve. But as the sun started to sink behind those limestone cliffs, painting the sky the color of fresh blood, everything changed. It started with that singing again, that high, eerie chanting that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then came the drums, not military drums, but something older, more primitive. The sound made your skin crawl and your teeth ache, and even the most battle-hardened Marines I'd served with looked nervous. "What the is that noise?" whispered Private Bobby Chen, a Chinese-American kid from San Francisco who'd joined up after Pearl Harbor. "Death song," said Kowalski grimly, peering through his rifle scope toward the jungle line. "They're working themselves up for something big." The something big came just as the last light faded from the sky. They poured out of the jungle like a human avalanche, hundreds of them, screaming banzai and tenno haika at the top of their lungs. Some carried rifles with fixed bayonets. Others had nothing but swords or bamboo spears or even rocks. They came in a wave of khaki and steel, their faces painted white with rice powder to honor the dead they expected to join, and they came with the absolute certainty that death in battle was preferable to life in defeat. The first rank hit our perimeter like a tsunami of flesh and fury. I emptied my M1 Garand into the charging mass, the familiar ping of the ejecting clip lost in the chaos of gunfire and screaming. A Japanese soldier, his uniform in tatters and his chest crisscrossed with bandoliers, leaped over our sandbag wall with a katana raised above his head. I managed to get my rifle up just in time to catch his blade on the stock, the impact jarring my arms and shoulders. We wrestled for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, rolling in the dirt and coral dust, each of us trying to kill the other with whatever we could grab. His face was inches from mine, and I could see he wasn't much older than me, maybe 22 or 23, with intelligent eyes and a small scar on his chin. In another life, we might have been friends. In this life, one of us had to die. I managed to work my bayonet loose and drive it up under his ribs, feeling the terrible resistance of muscle and bone before the steel found his heart. His eyes went wide with surprise, and for just a moment, the fury left his face and he looked almost peaceful. Then he was dead, and I was rolling his body off me and scrambling for another clip. The charge lasted maybe 20 minutes, but it felt like 20 hours. When it was over, the ground in front of our perimeter was carpeted with Japanese bodies, some piled 3 and 4 deep where they'd fallen trying to breach our lines. The few wounded were dispatched by their own men with grenades or pistol shots. The Japanese considered surrender worse than death, and wounded soldiers were expected to commit suicide rather than burden their comrades or face the shame of capture. We counted 847 Japanese dead in front of our position that night. 847 men who'd chosen to die rather than retreat, rather than surrender, rather than live to fight another day. It was my first real taste of what we were up against, not just an enemy, but a philosophy that made death preferable to defeat. And we were only 3 days into what would become a 73-day nightmare that would consume more than 20,000 Japanese lives and change forever how we thought about war in the Pacific. By the 10th day on Saipan, we'd learned to read the island like a book written in blood and gunpowder. Every ridge had its own personality, every cave system its own particular brand of death. The Japanese had spent 2 years turning this place into a fortress, and they'd done their work well. Too well. We were pushing north toward Garapan, the island's largest town, when we hit what the intelligence boys had marked on their maps as Cave Complex 7. It looked innocent enough from a distance, just another limestone outcropping dotted with dark holes, like a piece of Swiss cheese carved by wind and water over 1,000,000 years. But those holes weren't natural formations. They were gun ports and observation posts and barracks and ammunition dumps, all connected by tunnels that ran deep into the heart of the rock. "I count at least 30 openings," reported Sergeant Martinez, our new squad leader since Kowalski had taken shrapnel in the leg during the 3rd banzai charge. Martinez was a tough Mexican-American from Texas who'd fought his way up from private and had the scars to prove it. Could be twice that many we can't see. I lowered my binoculars and wiped the sweat from my eyes. The tropical heat was like wearing a wet blanket made of fire, and after 10 days of constant fighting, we all looked like scarecrows, hollow-eyed and gaunt. our uniforms hanging loose on frames that had shed 20 pounds of flesh since we'd hit the beach. "Movement," whispered Private Tommy O'Brien, pointing toward a shadow that seemed to shift near the base of the cliff. O'Brien had eyes like a hawk and nerves like piano wire. He'd been a hunter in the mountains of Montana before the war, and he could spot movement that the rest of us would miss. The movement turned out to be a Japanese soldier dragging something or someone into one of the lower caves. At this distance, we couldn't tell if it was a wounded comrade or supplies or ammunition. What we could tell was that the caves were very much occupied and very much fortified. Standard cave assault, Martinez decided, consulting his watch. Bangalore torpedoes to seal the obvious exits, then flamethrowers and satchel charges for the rest. O'Brien, you and Chen take the high ground and give us covering fire. Santos, you're on the radio. Morrison, you're with me and the Flame team. The Flame team was 2 Marines from the 2nd Division who'd been attached to our unit after their squad gotcha'd up at Red Beach 1. Corporal Jim Tech Houston was a lanky farm boy from outside Dallas who handled the flamethrower like it was just another farm tool. His assistant, Private First Class Eddie Torino from Brooklyn, carried the fuel canisters and had a nervous habit of cracking his knuckles when he was scared, which was most of the time. "You boys ready to barbecue some caves?" Tech asked with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. The flamethrower crews had the worst job in the whole war, in my opinion. They had to get close enough to Japanese positions to spray liquid fire in tow-enclosed spaces, which meant close enough for the enemy to throw grenades at them, shoot them, or worse. Most flame teams didn't last a week. We approached Cave Complex 7 like we were walking into a church, quiet, respectful, and ready to meet our maker. The Japanese had learned to let us get close before opening fire, maximizing casualties and creating the maximum psychological impact. Nothing quite prepares you for the moment when a quiet hillside suddenly erupts with machine gun fire and the whistle of incoming mortars. The first shot came from a cave about 40 feet up the cliff face, a single rifle crack that took off Private Williams' helmet and part of his scalp with it. Williams dropped like a sack of grain, blood streaming down his face, and suddenly the whole complex came alive with muzzle flashes and the angry buzz of bullets ricocheting off rocks. Torino yelled, diving behind a boulder and clutching his fuel canisters like a mother holding her baby. "They're in every hole." Martinez was already on the radio calling for artillery support, but the caves were too close to our position for effective fire. We were going to have to do this the hard way, yard by yard, cave by cave, with flame and steel and whatever courage we could scrape together. "Tech, can you reach that machine gun nest at 2 o'clock? Martinez shouted over the gunfire. Tech studied the cliff face, calculating angles and distances with the cold precision of a mathematician. "Give me covering fire and I can get close enough to fry their breakfast," he said. What followed was 10 minutes of pure we laid down suppressing fire while Tech and Torino worked their way up the slope, ducking from rock to rock, crater to crater. I watched through my rifle scope as Tech reached firing position, maybe 20 yards from a cave mouth that was spitting machine gun fire like an angry dragon. The flamethrower ignited with a whoosh that you could feel in your bones, sending a stream of liquid fire arcing through the air and into the cave opening. The screaming started immediately, not the battle cries we'd grown accustomed to, but the high, inhuman shrieks of men burning alive. The machine gun fire stopped abruptly, replaced by smaller explosions as ammunition cooked off in the heat. But Tech's victory was short-lived. A Japanese soldier emerged from a concealed position above the cave, his uniform on fire but still clutching a grenade. He pulled the pin and threw himself down toward Tech and Torino, turning his own burning body into a weapon. The explosion killed all 3 men instantly, the Japanese soldier, Tech, and Torino. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, replaced by a crater in the rock and the acrid smell of high explosives mixed with burned flesh. Martinez screamed, his voice cracking with rage and frustration. That was the thing about fighting the Japanese on Saipan. Every small victory came with a terrible price, and they were willing to pay any price to make us pay in return. They didn't just choose death over surrender. They weaponized death, turned it into another tool of war. A wounded Japanese soldier wasn't just out of the fight, he was a potential booby trap. A burning Japanese position wasn't necessarily neutralized, It might be bait for a larger trap. We spent the next 6 hours reducing Cave Complex 7, cave by cave, tunnel by tunnel. We used Bangalore torpedoes to seal exits, satchel charges to collapse tunnels, and flamethrowers to clear the spaces too deep for explosives. We found ammunition stockpiles, medical supplies, and food stores that could have kept a battalion supplied for months. We also found something else, evidence that the caves had been used as shelters for Japanese civilians. In one of the deeper chambers, Santos discovered a pile of children's clothing, neatly folded and stacked as if someone had been planning to wash them. In another, O'Brien found a family photograph, a Japanese man in civilian clothes standing with his wife and 3 children in front of what looked like a sugar plantation. "Where are they?" O'Brien asked quietly, holding the photograph up to the light of his flashlight. "Where are the people who lived here?" We'd find out soon enough. The civilian population of Saipan, men, women, and children who'd called this island home, had been caught in the middle of our war, and they were paying a price that none of us had anticipated when we'd landed on those beaches 2 weeks ago. But that revelation was still ahead of us. For now, we had Cave Complex 7 to finish clearing, and caves had a way of fighting back even when you thought they were dead. Martinez was checking his map when the explosion came from deeper in the complex. It wasn't the sharp crack of a grenade or the thump of a mortar. It was bigger, deeper, the kind of explosion that shakes the ground under your feet and makes your ears ring 4 hours afterward. "Cave in," Chen reported, emerging from one of the tunnel entrances covered in limestone dust and coughing like a coal miner. Whole back section just collapsed. Japs must have set charges to bring it down on themselves rather than let us clear it. Rather than surrender the position. Rather than live to fight another day from another position. They'd chosen to be buried alive under tons of rock rather than retreat. It was a level of commitment to death that we were still learning to comprehend, and it would define every day of the battle for Saipan until the very end. When we finally finished with Cave Complex 7, we counted the bodies we could reach: 43 Japanese soldiers and, God help us, 6 civilians, including 2 children. The rest were buried under tons of collapsed limestone, and we'd never know exactly how many lives that complex had consumed. But we were learning the arithmetic of Saipan. Every position cost lives, every cave demanded blood, and every yard of progress toward the cliffs meant more American boys in body bags and more Japanese soldiers who'd chosen death over defeat. And we still had 40 miles of island to cross, with hundreds more cave complexes between us and the northern cliffs where this whole nightmare would finally reach its terrible conclusion. 3 weeks into the battle, we learned that at coordinates 15.2178 degrees north, 145.7286 degrees east, the exact location of the Harakiri Gulch sugar mill, where the Japanese had established their final defensive line before the northern cliffs. The mill had been one of the island's most important industrial sites before the war, processing sugarcane from the surrounding plantations that had made Saipan prosperous under Japanese rule. Now it was a fortress bristling with machine gun nests, mortar positions, and enough interconnected bunkers to house a regiment. The Japanese had spent months turning every building, every storage silo, every piece of industrial equipment into part of an integrated killing machine. But it wasn't just the fortifications that made the sugar mill complex a nightmare. It was what we found there, evidence of what happened when an entire population chose death over surrender, and what that choice meant for the innocent people caught in the crossfire. Intelligence says there's a network of storage tunnels under the mill. Lieutenant Morrison, no relation, despite the name, briefed us as we crouched in the ruins of what had once been a plantation manager's house. The Japs have been using them as barracks and ammunition storage. Could be anywhere from 50 to 500 defenders down there. Lieutenant Morrison was a good officer who'd worked his way up from sergeant after his predecessor had been killed by a sniper during the push toward Garapan. He was from Oregon, had taught high school history before the war, and had a habit of explaining the tactical situation like he was giving a lecture to a classroom full of teenagers. "What about civilians?" asked Private Rodriguez, who joined us as a replacement after we'd lost half our squad to a booby-trapped cave 2 days earlier. Rodriguez was from New Mexico, barely 19, and still had that look in his eyes that said he believed he was going to make it home alive. "Unknown," the lieutenant admitted. "Could be none, could be hundreds." The Japanese military has been encouraging civilian participation in the defense of the island. They've been telling them that surrender means slavery or worse at the hands of American forces. Encouraging civilian participation. That was military speak for something much darker and more complex. The Japanese had been indoctrinating civilian population, men, women, and children who'd lived peacefully on Saipan for decades, with stories of American atrocities, convincing them that death was preferable to capture. Fathers were killing their own families rather than allow them to be taken prisoner. Mothers were throwing their children off cliffs before jumping themselves. Entire extended families were committing collective suicide rather than face what they'd been told would be torture and murder at American hands. The propaganda was lies, of course. American forces had standing orders to treat civilians humanely, to provide medical care and food to non-combatants, to distinguish between soldiers and innocent bystanders. But the Japanese population of Saipan had been fed a steady diet of horror stories for months, and by the time we arrived, many of them genuinely believed that death was their only escape from American barbarity. We approached the sugar mill complex at dawn on July 4, 1944, Independence Day, though none of us were feeling particularly festive. The irony wasn't lost on us that we were spending America's birthday fighting house to house through a sugar plantation on a Pacific island most of us had never heard of 6 months earlier. The first indication that this was going to be different from our previous engagements came when Santos, who was on point, spotted movement in the ruins of the main processing building. Through his binoculars, he could see figures moving among the machinery, but they weren't soldiers. "Sir," Santos whispered into his radio, "I'm seeing women and children in the target area." "Repeat, civilians in the target area." Lieutenant Morrison crawled forward to confirm the sighting, and his face went pale when he lowered his binoculars. He muttered, "There's got to be 50 of them, maybe more." What we were seeing was a group of Japanese civilian families who'd taken shelter in the mill, probably believing that the industrial buildings would offer protection from our artillery. They were clustered around what had once been the main processing floor, surrounded by suitcases and bundles of belongings that suggested they'd been planning to evacuate, but had run out of time. "What's the play, Lieutenant?" Martinez asked. "We can't assault with civilians in the way." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the layout through his field glasses. The civilians were definitely there, but so were Japanese soldiers. He could see the glint of rifle barrels and the distinctive shape of machine gun bipods positioned among the machinery. The Japanese were using the civilian population as human shields, counting on our reluctance to fire on innocent people to give them a tactical advantage. We tried to negotiate. Morrison decided. "Rodriguez, you speak any Japanese?" "A little, sir." "Picked up some basics in training." "Get on the loudspeaker. Tell them we want to evacuate the civilians. Tell them we'll guarantee safe passage for any non-combatants who want to surrender." Rodriguez took the portable loudspeaker and began speaking in halting Japanese, explaining our offer and assuring the civilians that they would be treated humanely if they surrendered. His words echoed off the concrete walls of the mill, sounding strange and formal in the tropical morning air. The response was immediate and heartbreaking. Instead of emerging to surrender, the civilian families huddled closer together, and we could hear crying and wailing coming from inside the building. Some of the women were holding their children tighter, and several of the men appeared to be arguing among themselves. Then came the gunfire, not from the Japanese soldiers, but from the civilians themselves. We watched in horror as Japanese fathers began shooting their own families, methodically executing their wives and children rather than allow them to surrender to American forces. The sound of gunshots mixed with screaming, and when the shooting stopped, the silence was somehow worse than the noise had been. "Mother of God," whispered O'Brien, lowering his rifle. "They're killing their own people." What followed was 15 minutes of pure as the Japanese soldiers, having eliminated what they saw as the burden of protecting civilians, launched a desperate counterattack from the mill complex. They came aid us with everything they had, rifles, machine guns, mortars, and finally, when their ammunition ran low, bayonets and swords and anything else they could use as weapons. But the worst part wasn't the fighting. The worst part was knowing that the bodies scattered throughout the mill complex weren't just enemy soldiers, they were families, children, innocent people who'd been convinced that death was preferable to American mercy. We cleared the mill building by building, room by room, and in every space we found evidence of the massacre that had preceded our assault. In what had been the plant manager's office, we found a Japanese businessman in a white shirt and tie who'd shot his wife and 2 young daughters before turning the pistol on himself. In the workers' cafeteria, we discovered the bodies of an entire extended family, grandparents, parents, children, even infants, arranged in a neat circle around a single-hand grenade that had killed them all. Private Chen found the worst scene in the mill's medical dispensary. A Japanese doctor had methodically poisoned more than 30 patients, men, women, and children who'd been seeking treatment for injuries and illnesses, rather than allow them to receive medical care from American forces. The bodies were laid out on stretchers and cots, looking almost peaceful except for the foam around their mouths and the empty bottles of medical chemicals scattered on the floor. "Why?" Chen asked, staring at the scene with tears streaming down his face. Why would they do this to their own people? I didn't have an answer for him. None of us did. We'd been trained to fight enemy soldiers, not to witness the systematic suicide of an entire population that had been convinced that death was preferable to life under American occupation. The Japanese soldiers we found in the mill complex fought with the same desperate fury we'd encountered everywhere else on the island, but there was something different about them too. They seemed almost relieved when we finally cornered them, as if the burden of their duty had been lifted now that the civilians were dead, and they could focus on dying honorably in battle. The final Japanese position in the mill was a concrete bunker that had been built into the foundation of the main processing building. It took us 3 hours to reduce it with satchel charges and flamethrowers, and when we finally broke through, we found 12 Japanese soldiers who'd barricaded themselves inside with enough ammunition to hold out for weeks. But they hadn't been trying to hold out. They'd been conducting their own funeral rites, preparing themselves for what they called the beautiful death of soldiers who die in battle for their emperor. When our charges blew open their bunker, they came out shooting, not to win or even to survive, but to die with honor according to their understanding of the warrior's code. We killed all 12 of them in less than a minute, but not before they'd wounded 2 of our men and demonstrated once again that surrender was simply not part of their vocabulary. When we finished clearing the sugar mill complex, the butcher's bill was staggering: 127 Japanese soldiers killed in action, along with 89 Japanese civilians who died by their own hands rather than surrender to American forces. On our side, we'd lost 8 men killed and 17 wounded, a relatively light casualty count that felt like a hollow victory when weighed against the civilian deaths we'd been powerless to prevent. But the sugar mill was just the beginning. Intelligence reports suggested that similar scenes were playing out all across the northern part of the island, as Japanese military commanders convinced civilian populations that mass suicide was preferable to capture. We were fighting an enemy that had weaponized death itself, turning every man, woman, and child into a potential casualty of their fanatical refusal to surrender. And ahead of us, rising like a wall against the northern sky, were the cliffs where this philosophy would reach its ultimate and most terrible expression. The cliffs where thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians would choose to jump to their deaths rather than face what they'd been told would be a fate worse than dying. The cliffs where we'd finally understand the true cost of fighting an enemy that had made death their highest virtue. By July 6, 1944, we'd pushed the Japanese back to their final defensive positions along the northern cliffs of Saipan. What remained of the Japanese garrison, maybe 3,000 soldiers out of the original 31,000, had concentrated their forces in a series of caves and bunkers carved into the limestone face of the precipice. Below them, 1,000 feet down, the Pacific Ocean crashed against jagged rocks that looked like the teeth of some ancient sea monster. But it wasn't just soldiers up in those cliffs. Intelligence estimates suggested that as many as 8,000 Japanese civilians had fled to the northern end of the island, seeking refuge in caves and hidden valleys that had become the last piece of Japanese-controlled territory on Saipan. They were trapped between our advancing forces in the sea, with nowhere to run and no way to escape the island that had become their tomb. I'd been promoted to sergeant after Martinez had been killed by a mortar round during the sugar mill assault, which meant I was now responsible for what remained of our squad: O'Brien, Chen, Santos, Rodriguez, and 3 replacements who'd arrived just in time to participate in what everyone knew would be the final act of the Saipan tragedy. The replacements were good men: Corporal James "Spike" Sullivan from Boston, Private Frank Kalchik from Detroit, and Private First Class William "Billy" Harper from a farm outside Kansas City. But they had that look in their eyes that said they knew they were joining the squad just in time to die. Aerial reconnaissance shows massive movement in the cliff caves. Lieutenant Morrison briefed us as we prepared for what we all hoped would be the final assault. Could be soldiers repositioning for a last stand. Could be civilians trying to find safe hiding places. Probably both. Morrison looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past month. His uniform hung loose on a frame that had lost at least 30 pounds. His eyes were sunken and hollow, and his hands shook slightly when he thought nobody was looking. He'd been a good officer throughout the campaign, but Saipan had a way of breaking even the strongest men, and I could see the cracks starting to show. "What's the plan, sir?" asked Sullivan, who'd been a construction foreman in civilian life and had a practical approach to problem-solving that I appreciated. "Three-pronged assault," Morrison explained, pointing to his map. "1st Battalion takes the eastern approach, 3rd Battalion comes up the western slope, and we get the honor of going straight up the middle. Intelligence thinks the main Japanese command post is in a cave complex about halfway up the cliff face. If we can take that out, we might be able to convince the rest to surrender." Convince them to surrender. Even after everything we'd seen, the banzai charges, the cave-ins, the civilian suicides, the fanatical resistance that had cost 20,000 Japanese lives, we still believed that somehow, someway, we might be able to end this thing without killing every last person on the northern cliffs. We were wrong, of course, but hope dies hard. Even in the middle of the assault began at 0530 hours on July 7th with the largest artillery barrage of the entire campaign. Every gun on the island, 155 mm howitzers, 105 mm field pieces, 81 mm mortars, plus naval gunfire from destroyers and cruisers offshore, concentrated their fire on the cliff face for 30 minutes straight. The sound was indescribable, like the end of the world arriving one shell at a time, and the limestone cliffs seemed to dissolve under the bombardment, sending avalanches of rock and dust cascading down to the beach below. When the barrage lifted, the cliffs looked like the surface of the moon, pockmarked with craters, scarred with fresh rock slides, shrouded in dust and smoke that turned the morning air thick as soup. Surely nothing could have survived that kind of punishment. Surely the Japanese positions had been reduced to rubble, their defenders buried under tons of collapsed stone. Surely we were about to learn, once again, how wrong we could be about an enemy that had turned dying into an art form. The first sign that the bombardment hadn't been as effective as we'd hoped came when O'Brien, who was on point as we began our climb up the eastern approach, spotted movement in what had looked like a completely destroyed cave mouth. "Contact front," he whispered into his radio, dropping behind a boulder and raising his rifle. "Cave system at 2 o'clock, maybe 40 yards up the slope." The movement turned out to be a Japanese soldier emerging from what had looked like a collapsed tunnel, his uniform torn, but his rifle still functional. He was followed by another soldier, then another, then a whole squad of men who'd somehow survived 30 minutes of direct artillery fire by burrowing deeper into the caves like human moles. Muttered Chen, "How many of them are left up there?" We'd find out soon enough. What followed was 6 hours of the most intense fighting any of us had ever experienced, as we discovered that the cliff face was honeycombed with caves and tunnels that went deeper than our intelligence had ever imagined. Every position we thought we'd destroyed with artillery fire turned out to be connected to 3 or 4 others by passages that had been carved by hand over months of preparation. The Japanese had turned the entire northern cliff into a 3-dimensional fortress, with firing positions that covered every possible approach and escape routes that allowed defenders to pop up, shoot, and disappear like deadly jack-in-the-boxes. Worse, they'd positioned their strongest points to create killing fields in the natural choke points where we'd be forced to climb, turning our assault into a shooting gallery with us as the targets. By noon, we'd managed to advance maybe 200 yards up the cliff face, and it had cost us dearly. Sullivan had taken a sniper's bullet through the shoulder and was being evacuated by the corpsman. Kalchik had stepped on a booby trap that had blown off his left foot, and left him screaming in a mixture of pain and rage until the morphine kicked in. Harper had simply disappeared during an assault on a cave position. One moment he was there, the next moment he wasn't, and we never found enough of him to send home to his parents in Kansas. But the worst was yet to come. At 1400 hours, as we were regrouping for another push toward what intelligence had identified as the main Japanese command cave, Santos spotted something that made his blood run cold. "Sergeant," he called, pointing toward a ledge about 100 feet above our position. "You need to see this." I crawled over to where Santos was, lying behind an outcropping of coral rock, and followed his gaze up to the ledge. What I saw there would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a Japanese family, a man, woman, and 3 small children, standing at the edge of the cliff with their arms around each other. They were dressed in their best clothes, as if they were going to church or attending a wedding, and they were looking down at the rocks and sea far below. "They're going to jump," Santos whispered, his voice tight with horror. He was right. As we watched, transfixed by the awful inevitability of what we were seeing, the Japanese father spoke quietly to his family, his words lost in the wind but his meaning clear from his gestures. He was explaining something to his children, perhaps telling them they were going to be together forever, perhaps promising them that what came next would be better than what they faced if they stayed alive. Then, without hesitation, without drama, without any of the theatrical gestures we'd come to expect from Japanese military suicide, the family simply stepped forward into empty air. They fell together, still holding each other, still dressed in their Sunday best, still believing that death was preferably to life under American occupation. The impact, when it came, was mercifully distant and brief, but the image of that family choosing death over surrender would be burned into my memory forever. "God Almighty," whispered Chen, his voice breaking. Those were just people. Just a family. But they weren't the only ones. As we continued our assault up the cliff face, we began to see more and more civilians emerging from the caves, not to surrender, not to seek protection, but to throw themselves to their deaths rather than face capture. Some came alone, some in pairs, some in entire family groups. They jumped from ledges, threw themselves from cave mouths, hurled themselves from rocky outcroppings with a determination that was both admirable and terrifying. The Japanese soldiers, meanwhile, were preparing for their own version of the same choice. At 1600 hours, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, we heard the sound that had become the soundtrack of our Saipan nightmare, the high, eerie chanting of men preparing to die. "Banzai charge," Rodriguez said grimly, checking his rifle and making sure his bayonet was securely attached. Big one from the sound of it. He was right. What came down those cliffs ate us wasn't just a banzai charge. It was a banzai avalanche, a human tsunami of men who decided that dying in battle was preferable to the slow strangulation of siege warfare. They came from every cave, every crevice, every hidden position on the cliff face, streaming down the rocky slopes like a khaki river of death. But these weren't the organized, disciplined charges we'd faced earlier in the campaign. These were the desperate, final gestures of men who knew they were beaten but refused to admit defeat. Some carried rifles, some had only bayonets, some clutched swords or grenades or even rocks. Many were wounded, some were barely able to walk, but they all came with the same fanatical determination to die fighting rather than live in defeat. The charge lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of continuous combat as wave after wave of Japanese soldiers threw themselves at our positions with the fury of men who'd already made peace with death. We fired until our barrels glowed red-hot, until our ammunition ran low, until our shoulders ached from the recoil and our ears rang from the constant noise of gunfire. I killed 17 men that afternoon. 17 human beings who'd chosen to die rather than surrender, who'd charged straight into our machine gun nests and rifle pits because they believed death in battle was the highest honor a soldier could achieve. Some of them were barely older than boys. Some were gray-haired veterans who'd probably been fighting since the war in China began. All of them died with the same expression on their faces. Not fear, not anger, but something that looked almost like relief. When the last charge finally broke against our positions, when the last Japanese soldier had been cut down by our crossfire, when the silence finally returned to the cliffs of northern Saipan, we began to count the cost. The bodies were piled so thick in front of our perimeter that we couldn't see the ground beneath them. Conservative estimates put the number of Japanese dead at over 1,500, but the true count was probably higher. Many bodies had fallen into crevices or been buried under rockslides triggered by the fighting. On our side, the casualties were lighter, but still painful. We'd lost 37 men killed and over 100 wounded during the final banzai charge, including Lieutenant Morrison, who'd taken a sword thrust through the chest while defending our command post. His last words, according to the radio man who was with him, were, "Tell them we held the line." But the fighting wasn't over. Even as we tended our wounded and counted our dead, even as the sun set over the Pacific and painted the cliffs the color of blood, we could hear movement in the caves above us. The Japanese weren't finished dying yet. What came next was something none of us had anticipated, something that would haunt the survivors of Saipan for the rest of their lives. It was the sound of voices, not the battle cries we'd grown accustomed to, not the death chants of soldiers preparing for their final charge, but something else entirely. They were singing. Hundreds of voices, maybe thousands, echoing from the caves and crevices of the cliff face in a song that was both beautiful and terrible. Later, we'd learn it was a traditional Japanese folk song about cherry blossoms falling, about the beauty of things that bloom briefly and then die, about the honor of a life that ends at its moment of greatest glory. It was a funeral song, sung by people who'd chosen to attend their own funerals. And as the last notes of the song faded into the tropical night, we began to hear the explosions. Not the sharp crack of grenades or the thump of mortars, but the deeper, more final sound of people detonating satchel charges in enclosed spaces, bringing down cave roofs on themselves and their families rather than face the morning and the possibility of surrender. The explosions continued through the night, dozens of them, each one representing another group of Japanese soldiers or civilians who'd chosen death over defeat. By dawn on July 8th, the cliff face was scarred with fresh rock slides and cave-ins, and the singing had stopped forever. When we finally climbed up to investigate the cave systems the next day, we found scenes that defied description. Entire families had died together in embraces that would last for eternity. Soldiers had committed ritual suicide with their own swords, leaving behind letters to their families and prayers to their emperor. Children had been killed by their own parents, who then killed themselves rather than allow their offspring to grow up under American occupation. The final count, when all the bodies were tallied and all the caves were searched, was staggering. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers had died in the final assault on the northern cliffs, along with nearly 1,000 civilians who'd chosen death over surrender. In 3 days of fighting, we'd witnessed the virtual extinction of an entire community that had chosen to die rather than live under foreign occupation. But perhaps the most haunting discovery came in the deepest cave, where we found the body of a Japanese general who'd been in command off the Saipan garrison. He'd committed seppuku, ritual suicide, in the traditional manner, disemboweling himself with his own sword before having his aide deliver the final blow to his neck. Beside his body was a letter, written in careful English, addressed to the American commander of Saipan. The letter was brief and formal, but its contents were devastating in their simplicity. The general apologized for the fanatical resistance his men had offered, explained that they'd been ordered to fight to the death rather than surrender, and asked that the American force treat any surviving civilians with humanity and respect. He closed by noting that his men had chosen death over dishonor, and that he hoped history would remember them as soldiers who'd done their duty to their emperor and their country. It was signed with a single line, "They chose death over surrender, and we face that choice every day." The same words I'd muttered to myself on the first day of the landing, when I thought I understood what we were facing on Saipan. Now, standing in that cave surrounded by the evidence of mass suicide, I realized I'd understood nothing at all. We'd won the battle for Saipan, but at a cost that would haunt everyone who'd participated in it for the rest of their lives. The Japanese had lost over 20,000 troops in what would go down in history as one of the bloodiest defeats in the Pacific War. But they'd also demonstrated something that would change how we thought about the war in the Pacific. They'd shown us that we were fighting an enemy that would literally rather die than surrender, and that meant every island, every battle, every mile of progress toward the Japanese home islands would be paid for in blood. The civilian suicides at Saipan would be repeated at Okinawa, where thousands more Japanese families would choose death over surrender. The military fanaticism we'd witnessed in the caves would be multiplied tenfold when we finally approached the sacred soil of Japan itself. The banzai charges, the cave fighting, the refusal to surrender, all of it would be intensified and amplified as we moved closer to the heart of the Japanese Empire. Standing on those cliffs at the northern end of Saipan, looking out over the Pacific toward the distant islands that still lay ahead of us, I finally understood what we were really fighting. Not just an enemy army, not just a military force, but a philosophy that made death preferable to defeat and suicide preferable to surrender. And I understood that the war we were fighting was far from over. The official casualty reports were filed 3 weeks after the last shot was fired on Saipan, but the real counting, the accounting of what we'd witnessed and what it meant, would continue for decades. I was sitting in a field hospital on Guam, my left arm in a sling from shrapnel I'd caught during the final cave clearing operations, when the final numbers came through on the radio. Japanese military dead, 29,426 confirmed, with another 1,800 estimated buried in collapsed caves and rock slides. Japanese civilian dead, 22,000 confirmed, with estimates ranging as high as 30,000 when missing persons were factored in. American dead, 3,426 killed in action, with another 13,099 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation. The numbers were staggering, but they didn't tell the whole story. They couldn't capture the moment when you watched a family choose to jump from a cliff rather than surrender to forces they'd been told were monsters. They couldn't quantify the psychological impact of fighting an enemy that turned every position into a suicide mission, every cave into a tomb, every retreat into a funeral pyre. Sitting in that hospital ward, surrounded by men who'd survived the 73-day nightmare of Saipan, I began to understand that we'd witnessed something unprecedented in modern warfare. Not just a military defeat, but the systematic self-destruction of an entire society that had been convinced that death was preferable to life under foreign occupation. "You hear about the interrogations?" asked Staff Sergeant Mike Kowalski. No relation to the Kowalski who'd been killed in the early days of the campaign. This Kowalski was from the 165th Infantry Regiment, and he'd been wounded during the assault on Mount Tapacho. They're talking to the prisoners, trying to figure out why they fought the way they did. There weren't many prisoners to interrogate. Out of an estimated 31,000 Japanese military personnel on Saipan at the start of the battle, fewer than 900 had been taken alive. Most were men who'd been knocked unconscious by explosions or buried in cave-ins, men who'd been physically unable to commit suicide or continue fighting. The few who'd surrendered voluntarily were considered traitors by their own countrymen and pariahs by the Japanese military code. "What are they saying?" I asked, genuinely curious about the mindset that had produced such fanatical resistance. "Same thing over and over," Kowalski replied, staring out the window at the Guam countryside. "They say they were ordered to fight to the death, that surrender was not an option, that dying in battle was the highest honor a soldier could achieve. But it's more than that. They genuinely believed that we were going to torture and kill them if they surrendered. They'd been told that Americans were barbarians who would their women, murder their children, and desecrate their ancestors. The propaganda had been incredibly effective. The Japanese military had spent months, maybe years, preparing the population of Saipan for the American invasion by filling their heads with horror stories about American atrocities. They'd shown them photographs, some real, some fabricated, of American soldiers committing acts of violence against civilians in other theaters of war. They'd told them that surrender meant slavery and murder, and that death was the only way to preserve their honor and protect their families. "The thing is," Kowalski continued, "some of them are starting to realize they were lied to. The ones who surrendered, or who were captured unconscious, they're seeing how we treat prisoners, how we're providing medical care and food, and basic human dignity. They're starting to understand that everything they were told about American brutality was false. That was perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire Saipan campaign. Thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians had died not because they were evil or because they were cowards, but because they'd been systematically lied to about what surrender would mean. They'd been told that Americans were monsters, and they'd believed those lies so completely that they'd chosen death over the possibility of discovering the truth. But the leash hadn't been confined to the Japanese side. We'd been told that the Japanese were subhuman fanatics who valued death over life, that they were incapable of reason or compassion, that they were fundamentally different from us in ways that made them irredeemably evil. Some of that propaganda had been based on real observations of Japanese military behavior, but much of it had been exaggerated or distorted to make us hate the enemy enough to kill them without hesitation. The reality, as we discovered during the long weeks of fighting on Saipan, was more complex. The Japanese soldiers we'd fought had been brave, disciplined, and utterly committed to their cause. They'd been willing to die for their beliefs, to sacrifice themselves for their comrades, to endure incredible hardship and suffering in defense of their positions. In many ways, they'd been everything we'd been taught to respect in a soldier. But they'd also been victims of a military culture that had perverted the concept of honor into a death cult, that had turned suicide into a virtue and surrender into the ultimate shame. They'd been indoctrinated from childhood to believe that death in battle was the highest achievement a human being could attain, and that living in defeat was worse than not living at all. "I keep thinking about that family," said Private First Class Danny Chen, who'd been transferred to our ward after losing his left eye to a grenade fragment, the one we saw jump from the cliff. "Those kids couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. What kind of world teaches parents to kill their own children rather than let them grow up under foreign occupation?" It was a question that haunted all of us who'd witnessed the civilian suicides on Saipan. We'd seen dozens of families choose death over surrender, hundreds of individuals who'd preferred jumping from cliffs to taking their chances with American forces. We'd seen children killed by their own parents, elderly people who'd chosen starvation over seeking American medical care, wounded civilians who'd crawled into caves to die rather than accept help from American corpsmen. The scale of the civilian casualties had been unprecedented in our experience. Previous Pacific campaigns had involved mostly military targets on isolated atolls with small native populations. Saipan had been different, a major population center with tens of thousands of Japanese civilians who'd been living there for decades, people who'd built homes and businesses and families on an island they'd considered a permanent part of the Japanese Empire. When we'd invaded Saipan, we'd expected to fight Japanese soldiers. We hadn't expected to witness the mass suicide of an entire civilian population that had been convinced that death was preferable to life under American rule. The psychological impact of watching families choose death over surrender had been devastating for many of our men, and it would influence American planning for the rest of the Pacific War. "The brass is worried about what happens when we hit the main islands," said Lieutenant Anderson, a young officer who'd been wounded during the final banzai charge and was now recovering in the bed next to mine. "If this is how Japanese civilians react to American occupation on an outlying land, what's going to happen when we invade Japan itself?" It was a question that was being asked at the highest levels of American military command. The fanatical resistance we'd encountered on Saipan, the willingness of entire populations to choose death over surrender, had forced military planners to reconsider their assumptions about how the war would end. If every Japanese island was going to require a campaign like Saipan, if every Japanese city was going to turn into a fortress defended by civilians willing to die rather than surrender, then the cost of invading the Japanese home islands would be astronomical. Estimates were already being prepared for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. The numbers were staggering. American casualties were projected at over 1 million dead and wounded, with Japanese military and civilian casualties potentially reaching into the tens of millions. The battle for Saipan had shown that the Japanese were willing to sacrifice their entire population rather than surrender, and that knowledge was reshaping American strategy for the final phase of the Pacific War. But sitting in that hospital ward, surrounded by men who'd survived the of Saipan, I wasn't thinking about grand strategy or military planning. I was thinking about faces. The face of the Japanese soldier killed in hand-to-hand combat during the first banzai charge. The face of the little girl who'd been holding her mother's hand when they jumped from the cliff. The face of the Japanese doctor who'd poisoned his own patients rather than let them receive American medical care. They'd all chosen death over surrender, and we'd faced that choice every day of the 73-day campaign. Not the choice to die. That was always a possibility in combat, but the choice to understand why our enemies were willing to die and what that willingness meant for the future of the war. The official history of the Battle of Saipan would record it as a decisive American victory that eliminated Japanese air and naval power in the Central Pacific and opened the way for the invasion of the Philippines. The casualty figures would be noted, the tactical innovations would be analyzed, the strategic implications would be debated by military historians for decades to come. But for those of us who'd been there, who'd witnessed the systematic self-destruction of an entire society that had been convinced that death was preferable to defeat, the Battle of Saipan would always be remembered as something else. A preview of the apocalyptic struggle that awaited us when we finally approached the sacred soil of Japan itself. The Japanese had lost over 20,000 troops in one of the bloodiest defeats in the Pacific War, but they'd also demonstrated that they were willing to pay any price, sacrifice any number of lives, accept any level of destruction rather than surrender. They'd shown that every mile of progress toward the Japanese home islands would be paid for in blood, and that the final victory would require us to overcome not just military resistance, but a philosophy that made death preferable to defeat. Sitting in that hospital ward on Guam, my arm in a sling and my head full of memories I'd never be able to erase, I finally understood what we were really fighting in the Pacific. Not just an enemy army, not just a military force, but an entire civilization that had chosen death over surrender, and that would make us choose between annihilation and victory. The ghosts of Saipan would haunt American military planning for the rest of the war, influencing everything from the decision to develop the atomic bomb to the strategy for ending the Pacific War without a ground invasion of Japan. The 20,000 Japanese dead on Saipan had become a demonstration of what total war really meant, and their sacrifice would ultimately help convince American leaders that the war had to be ended by other means. But that was still in the future. For now, we had islands to take, battles to fight, and an enemy to defeat that had proven they'd rather die than surrender. The counting of ghosts would continue, and the price of victory would be measured in more than just military casualties. They'd chosen death over surrender, and we'd face that choice every day. Now we'd have to live with the memory of what that choice had cost, and what it would continue to cost until the war finally ended. The Battle of Saipan was over, but its lessons would echo through the remainder of the Pacific War and beyond. In the end, it would take 2 atomic bombs to convince the Japanese leadership that further resistance was futile, that death was not always preferable to surrender, and that sometimes the highest honor lay not in dying for one's country, but in living to rebuild it. But that understanding would come at a price measured in cities destroyed, populations displaced, and memories that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The ghosts of Saipan would be joined by the ghosts of Okinawa, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki before the counting was finally done. And in the end, we'd all have to live with the knowledge that we'd witnessed something unprecedented in human history, the systematic self-destruction of an entire society that had been convinced that death was preferable to defeat, and that had chosen to die rather than surrender to an enemy they'd been taught to fear more than death itself.